Hello and welcome to this presentation on launching virtual servers on Amazon EC2. My name is Janakiram. I am from Get Cloud Ready Consulting. So the agenda for today's presentation is what really powers the application. I'm going to walk you through what really powers the contemporary application. Then we'll take a look at compute on the cloud, how to deal with compute on the cloud, and then some of the key concepts of Amazon EC2, followed by demos on launching and connecting to virtual servers. So what really powers an application? Irrespective of the application that you're developing, you're effectively going to deal with 4 different building blocks: compute, storage, networking, and database. Compute is primarily the server that's actually powering the application. This is where the horsepower required for the application is delivered. Storage is very critical for contemporary applications, since this is going to power the storage component of the application. Especially with so much of user-generated content and media explosion on the web, storage plays a very critical role. Networking basically enables 2 machines to talk to each other, and beyond that, it also provides load balancers, firewalls, routers, switches, and so on. So it's essential that you have networking as a component when you're dealing with more than one server. And of course, you need a database. And the data of the current application architecture requires you to deal with unstructured, structured, and semi-structured. So databases in current world can be classified into relational database, NoSQL database, and even semi-structured databases that go into typically the NoSQL databases. Now the application deals with these underlying building blocks through a variety of APIs. And these APIs can be classified into application services and management services API. So these APIs enable the applications to deal with an appropriate building block. For example, an application can use JDBC or ODBC to talk to the database. They can use the storage API to programmatically create resources and manipulate resources. And some of the applications also require to deal with the file system and low level programming interfaces. So they form the application services. Similarly, applications need to programmatically deal with administration and management, and those services are exposed through the management services. So irrespective of the kind of application that you are developing, you might have to deal with either application services or management services or both. Now mapping this to Amazon Web Services, it's not very different. So at the top of the stack you have your application, and at the bottom of the stack you have AWS Global Infrastructure, which primarily translates to physical servers deployed all over the globe. Now just above the global physical infrastructure, Amazon does expose foundation services in the form of compute, storage, databases, and networking. Amazon EC2 is Elastic Compute Cloud, which is actually delivering the compute service. Amazon S3 Simple Storage Service delivers the durable storage capability on the cloud. Databases are experienced through Amazon's Relational Database Service or DynamoDB, SimpleDB, and an in-memory database called Elasticache. And finally, the networking building blocks named as Elastic Load Balancer, Amazon Route 53, the DNS as a service, Amazon's VPC, the virtual private cloud, and finally the Direct Connect that connects an on-premise infrastructure, primarily a data center, to Amazon's infrastructure. So the remaining 2 layers form the management and application services. But whether you are dealing with the cloud or on-premise, you will notice that you will still have to deal with the building block services like compute, storage, databases, and networking. So today's focus is primarily on Amazon EC2. So let's understand a little bit more about that. Amazon EC2 is virtual computing environment that is exposed by the standard web service interfaces. What it really means is, as a developer or as an administrator, you can launch virtual servers on the cloud by using the standard web interfaces. So that actually provides reusable and resizable compute capacity on the cloud. So it is resizable because you can scale up and scale out your virtual servers. Once you configure your virtual machine, you can also reuse it multiple times by creating a template and then launching multiple instances of the template. When we are talking about templates, we need to talk about the pre-configured images that Amazon themselves deliver, and they are called Amazon machine images. It's not just dealing with the templates and the virtual machines. There is obviously security and restricted networking access that you can configure. So you can decide which ports to open, which ports to close, and who can access your virtual servers. And the best thing, this is available on a pay-as-you-go pricing model. That means you'll only pay for what you really use. Some of the typical use cases for Amazon EC2 happen to be application hosting. This is primarily moving your line of business applications or SaaS applications to the cloud. So you can run multiple virtual machines that powers your application in a high availability mode. Many enterprise applications are now moved to EC2 by leveraging the capabilities of the compute on the cloud. Similarly, content management systems like Joomla, Drupal, WordPress are good candidates for EC2 because you can again configure them in high availability mode, fault tolerant mode, and automate your deployments. So if you are dealing with content management systems, you should certainly consider Amazon EC2. And then many e-commerce sites are powered by Amazon EC2. If you are building an e-commerce portal that's powered by Magento or PrestaShop or OS Commerce, OpenCart, any of this, it might make a great choice to deploy your e-commerce portal on Amazon EC2. Then comes in media hosting, which is delivering either static media content or live streaming content. And again, a combination of Amazon EC2, S3 and CloudFront actually make it very viable for you to take your media hosting to the cloud. And finally, classic web hosting, where you might want to run a marketing site or even a static website. They make great candidates for the cloud. You have a variety of choices when it comes to deploying your applications on Amazon Web Services, and EC2 happens to be the core building block. So let's start with the global footprint and the global infrastructure that AWS has. Currently, AWS operates across 9 different locations all over the globe. Some of the point of presence of AWS happen to be the CloudFront edge locations, which primarily deliver the caching content which is originating from a different source. But those bigger dots that you see are primarily the AWS regions, which are actually the physical data centers set up by Amazon. So these data centers are spread all over the globe, and there are about 9 of them. A few in US, one in Europe, quite a few in Asia Pacific, the recent entry being Sydney with APAC 3 region, and there is one in US West too, and there has been another edition in South America at Sao Paulo. So this gives the wide range of geographic locations for customers to choose from. So depending on where your customers are coming from, you could actually deploy your application in one of the regions. Now every region is further divided into logical facilities called as availability zones. These availability zones are physically isolated and have independent infrastructure to provide high speed, high availability and fault tolerance to your applications. They're obviously connected by high-speed networks, thus reducing the latency and offering high availability. And every time Amazon launches a region, they have at least 2 availability zones. So when you're launching your server, you can launch it in 2 different locations and synchronize your database so that you have a fallback and fault tolerance built into your application. So it's important to understand the concepts of regions and availability zones when you are deploying an application on top of Amazon EC2. As we notice here, in one region, for example, if you take Singapore, there are two availability zones. Some of the traditional regions of Amazon happen to have more than two availability zones. For example, US East comes with 3 availability zones. But every time AWS launches a new region, they typically go live with at least 2 availability zones. Once you understand the concept of region and availability zone, the third important concept to understand is the Amazon machine image. So Amazon machine image is primarily a template or a virtual machine image. This comes with a pre-installed operating system and sometimes optional application software. For example, you might want to launch a plain vanilla Linux or a Microsoft Windows virtual machine, or you could also go higher up in the stack and launch a pre-configured WordPress or a Joomla or Drupal, or even very high-end enterprise software like SAP or IBM WebSphere, Oracle, and so on. Once you identify an AMI, it can be used to launch multiple instances. Amazon has a variety of pre-built AMIs in the catalog. Some of them are actually built by the community and they are published to the public catalog through which you can launch the software that you are looking for. Amazon also has a marketplace that lets you choose the stack that you want to launch and launch it with single click. Once you launch an instance from the template called the AMI, you have a choice to customize it and save it back as a template. And this process of customizing an existing AMI and creating your own AMI is called bundling. Now you got to remember that an AMI is independent of the configuration. That means when you're dealing with an AMI, you never worry about the specification like the processor, memory, bandwidth, disk space, and so on. This is just a software configuration or the software template. And obviously every AMI is uniquely identified through the AMI ID. So when you're launching from command line or through the API, it's important for you to make a note of the AMI ID that you're trying to launch. Once you have understood the concept of AMI, then it's about instances. So an instance type is typically mapped to a hardware specification. This is directly aligned with the specs and the configuration that you would associate with a server. For example, when you are buying a new server or when you are planning your capacity for your new application, you would look at your infrastructure in terms of the CPU, in terms of memory, and the storage. The same thing applies when you are choosing the right instance type. Amazon does offer a variety of instance types. For example, there is standard, medium, high memory, high CPU, high I/O, and so on. Based on your workload and the demand of your application, you could choose one of the instance types to launch your application. So the instance type that you choose definitely influences the performance and also cost. So you got to be very clear on what kind of instance type you're going to choose. So you essentially pick up an existing AMI and apply that to an instance type and launch your instance or the virtual machine. Now this table presents the comparison, including the pricing details of various Linux instances launched in Singapore. As you notice, there are a variety of configurations to choose from, and based on the configuration, the pricing does change. For example, the entry-level instance type happens to be a micro instance, which comes with a variable compute capacity of 2 CPUs or 2 ECUs, elastic compute units, and it comes with roughly half a GB of RAM, and this is going to cost you 2.5 cents an hour. You could also launch high-end instances, for example a quadruple extra large, which is a high memory instance that comes with 70 GB of memory, and that's going to cost you 2.28 dollars in Singapore. So we are talking about launching a Linux instance in Singapore based on a variety of instance types. So once you chose your region, availability zone, the machine image and the instance, then comes in the security group. So think of the security group as a virtual firewall for EC2. So when you launch an EC2 instance, you got to allow or restrict traffic to either a specific port or originating from a specific IP address, or the connection flowing through an existing set of security groups. So these policies define who can access your servers and what services they can access. Configuring security groups and understanding how security groups works is very essential to protect the assets that you launch on AWS. So just to do a quick recap, when you are launching an Amazon EC2 instance, you start by choosing the right region, then you choose an availability zone, followed by choosing the right AMI and applying an instance type, and finally configuring the security. So it's time for us to go through a demo of launching a server and configuring WordPress on it. Okay, so let's first sign into the AWS console. I have already entered my credentials, and assuming you have already completed the sign up with Amazon Web Services, you first land into the home page of the AWS Management Console, and this is where you get to see various services that belong to the Amazon Web Services infrastructure. So let me click on EC2, and once I choose this, my next choice is selecting an appropriate region. Since I live in India, Singapore happens to be the closest location, so I'm going to choose Asia Pacific as my region, and then I'm going to click on Launch Instance. So Launch Instance takes me to a wizard through which I can choose various options. So here what you see is a variety of Amazon machine images. For example, I might want to launch Ubuntu or a SUSE Linux instance or Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Microsoft Windows Server, various flavors of Microsoft Windows Server, or even Amazon's own Linux, highly optimized for AWS, called Amazon Linux AMI. And this is where I get to choose between the 32-bit and 64-bit. So I choose 64-bit, and here you're noticing a star, which is an indication that this instance supports Amazon's free tier. So AWS free tier lets you launch or consume various AWS resources up to a specific threshold. For example, if you are dealing with EC2, you can launch a micro instance and run it for the whole month for free for the next 1 year from the time you sign up. That means you can effectively launch an instance and run it 24/7 for the whole month, which will come to approximately 750 hours. And after that, again it gets reset and you can run it for next 1 month. That you can repeat for 12 months to complete or to enjoy your first 1 year of free tier. So this star is an indication that when you launch an instance of this type, you have a choice to launch it within the free tier threshold. So I will choose 64-bit and click on select, and this is where I get to choose from the instance types. So here micro instance is free tier eligible, and as we discussed earlier, it comes with 2 elastic compute units and approximately half a GB of memory. I can go all the way up to quadruple extra large, or the new generation instance types, which will give me more power, more configuration. But I want to keep this simple, so I'm going to choose micro instance, and then I can also choose an availability zone. In our case, we are just launching one instance, so it doesn't make much difference. But if you're launching more than one instance, you might want to target a different availability zone for each. so that you can bring in high availability. So I'm going to leave this with no preference, and in the next step I can actually have some of the advanced configuration, but this is not really required for our demo, so I'm going to safely skip this step and move to the next step where I can modify the storage device. So again, I need not really change this because I'm fine with an 8 GB root volume. So I'll click on continue, and here I'm expected to give a name to the server. So let's call this WordPress and click on continue. So here I got to choose my private key. Because every instance that's being launched on EC2 is available to the public, it may not be a good idea to use clear text username and password. So Amazon insists to use public key infrastructure, where the public key is stored on Amazon's infrastructure and the private key is downloaded to your machine. So I've already created my private key and downloaded that, so I'm going to choose the same key and click on continue, and this is where we actually get to deal with the security group. So when I'm launching this instance, I have an option to create a new security group where I can give the name of the security group. For example, let's call this WordPress demo security group, and then let's add SSH and also add HTTP. So this will ensure that I can log into this and also access the web server through port 80. If I want, I can also customize the IP address range from which the traffic is originating. For example, I might want to restrict the SSH access to a specific IP address. So by modifying this and keying in the right IP address will allow the login only to happen from that machine. So I've already configured a security group, so I'm going to choose that. Then finally in this screen we get a chance to review the configuration and all the options that we have selected. So now I'm going to click on the launch button. This is going to take a couple of minutes for the instance to come up. As you see, this is currently in pending state, and in a few seconds this should turn into running, and we'll also notice the color changing to green. So while we'll wait for that, let me launch my terminal window and move into my working directory. So this is where I already have my private key. So I am waiting for the instance to come up. So there we go. Now the instance is available for us. It has moved into the running mode. All I got to do is grab the public DNS name. So I'm going to get this, switch back to the terminal window and use SSH command to log into my instance as EC2 user. So it may take a while for the instance to really boot up and the SSH service to become available. So we will give it few more seconds. Looks like it's still not ready. Normally it takes about a minute. Now it's up and running. So I'm going to log in into my EC2 instance. So I am currently logged in as EC2 user. So the first step for me is to become a root user by typing sudo -i. Now we have become the root user, and I'm going to run a series of commands to actually deploy WordPress. So let me copy and paste a series of commands. So the first set of commands I'm going to run is to set up Apache, MySQL and PHP. So this is going to take just a minute to configure the proper LAMP stack. Since the yum repository is available within the EC2 environment, it's fairly fast to get all the appropriate dependencies and the packages. So in a second we see that it's completely set up. After that I run another series of commands to make sure that the services run every time I restart my machine. I also change the default password of my MySQL database, and I create a database by name WordPress so that we have all the prerequisites for installing WordPress. Then I'm going to basically run few commands to download the latest version of WordPress and also unzip that into an appropriate directory, which is var.w3.html. That's it. Now we have done everything required to. So now we have accessed the WordPress installation. So I'm going to create a configuration file and go through a few steps. So let me change the username to root. Everything else remains the same, and then I click on submit. So here it's asking us to create a wp config.php. So let's go back to the folder where we have WordPress installed and create the configuration file required for WordPress, and then say run the install. So let's call this cloud ready blog and key in a password that we can remember, and of course the email address. So that's it. Now we have entered all the details. So it's time for me to log in using the username admin and the password that we created. So this is going to give us the access to WordPress, and let's open the actual blog. So there we go. So this is basically the simple blog that I created, all the way from launching our first server to deploying WordPress, configuring it, and going live. So that was our first demo. And as we have noticed, it's been extremely simple to launch a server, log in, install the required software, configure WordPress, and just go live with it. In the last demo, we have seen launching a Linux instance and configuring WordPress. Now I want to show you how I can launch and connect to a Windows server running on top of Amazon EC2. Okay, so this is a demo to actually launch a Windows Server instance. So let's go through the same steps, but here I'm actually going to choose Microsoft Windows Server 2008 R2 with SQL Server and IAS. So obviously this comes only with 64 GB and it's also free tier eligible. So I'm going to select that and keep this as the T1 micro, and I have no preferences for the availability zone. Nothing much to configure in this step, so we'll move to the next one. And this comes with 30 GB of storage, so that's fine. And then let me call this Windows Server. So Windows Server is the name of the instance that we are creating, so let me also associate this with the key. So this is the same private key that I have used for the previous instance, so that's my private key which is on my machine, so I will leave this as it is, and then point this to one of the security groups that I created earlier, which will also give me access to remote desktop protocol or terminal services. Then I finally review the configuration. So I am launching Windows Server 2008 R2 with SQL Server Express and IAS. The configuration is T1 micro, the instance type, this is a key pair, and now I'm going to click on launch. To actually save time, I have already launched the instance. So here, once the instance comes up, all I got to do is to get the Windows password. We don't have SSH equivalent here, so we still need to gain access to the Windows password. So for that, I'm going to actually choose the file, and select my PIM file there and click on decrypt password. So here this is going to give me the decrypted password which is randomly generated during the instance creation. So I copy that and click on close. So now I have the Windows server that's running and the public DNS name is available here. So it's time for me to launch the remote desktop connection and enter the password that's been decrypted for us. Click on OK. So this is going to open up the remote desktop connection, and there we go. So in a second I should be able to log into my Windows Server instance running on EC2. So this is basically my Windows Server instance that I have just launched. The process between launching a Linux server or a Windows server is not very different. It's exactly the same. So except that we use the same private key to decrypt the password. So that was a quick demo of launching a Windows instance and logging to it. So if you are looking for resources, you can visit getcloudready.com/ebooks, where you can download a book called Demystifying the Cloud, which gives you a jump start to cloud computing. And you can find various tutorials and recordings of my past webinars at cloudready.tv. So thanks for attending this presentation on launching your first server on Amazon EC2. This is Janakiram signing off, and if you have questions, feel free to reach me at mail@getcloudready.com or follow me on Twitter at janakiram.m.